Hello, and thank you for attending and participating in CU Data Week. This is our second to last presentation, um, but we do have an office. We do have an office hour on Friday for you to come to ask any questions that you might have from presentations this week or presentations from last week. So what I'm going to do in the chat, I am going to put in a link. This will take you to our CU Data Week website where then you can go on and register to come to our office hours on Friday. And then we are having a how to create a REDCap database that statisticians will love a seminar tomorrow. So we would love for you to come and attend that as well. There we go. Okay. Please also stay till the end of our seminar. We would like you to take our attendance survey. We would love to get your feedback on specifically this seminar, as well as what you would like to see in the future from CU Data Week. This also will enter you into our raffle to win a $75 gift card to Amazon. So however many that you've attended, that's how many times your name is entered to the raffle. So the more that you attend, the more times your name will be in the raffle. So please fill that out. We definitely want to hear from you. Next thing I'm putting on here is the link for the Dropbox. So this is where you can get the presentation from today, as well as all the presentations from this week, and then also where the presentation will be for tomorrow. So please go to that Dropbox so you can get access to all of the materials from CU Data Week. And then that is it for me. I'm going to turn it over to Lauren, who's going to do our advanced data management for SAS, teaching us about SAS macros.
Great. Thank you so much, Samantha. So for all of you, my name is Lauren Gunn-Sandell, and I'm going to be giving an introduction to using the SAS macro facility today. So at any point, if you have questions, please feel free to enter them into the chat, and Samantha will be monitoring questions throughout the presentation. And then if you're comfortable, you can also raise your hand and we can unmute and you can ask your question live. So today I'm going to be giving an introduction to SAS macro variables and macro programs, and I do assume that you have some familiarity with SAS programming as well as general data set structure. But if you do have questions about SAS in general, as Samantha mentioned, please come to our office hours on Friday. Both her and I will be there answering questions as you need. So today I am going to be using SAS data sets that are readily available in the SAS help library. So I'm working in the windowing environment today. If you've downloaded the SAS script program, you can also upload it into SAS Studio and execute all of the code there based on what environment you are working in. So just to show you what we'll be working with today, if you are using the windowing environment, or in SAS Studio, you're going to have your libraries navigation tool on the left-hand side of your screen. And then there's a library called SAS Help, and there are dozens of SAS data sets and format catalogs that are readily available for you to test code and play around. So I'm going to be using a couple of these today throughout the program. And so you'll notice I'm not setting up any type of directory to my local drive. And that's because I'm not accessing any data outside of the SAS environment. Okay, so to get started, I also recognize that perhaps everyone has their screens and tabs a little differently if they're working in the windowing environment. And I like to have my log viewable, and that's this tab up here. It's a separate window. As I execute SAS code throughout the session, I want to be able to see the log immediately there. And then I'll talk about the results in a second. So to get started, what are SAS macros? And so there are two categories of macros. The first are macro variables, and then the second are macro programs. And I will go over those both today. Both SAS macro variables and macro programs use base SAS's macro facility. And if you're interested in learning more about that, I have included a link to SAS's documentation in the code. So to get started with macro variables, what are these? So macro variables are a single text value that are stored as a string, even if that value may be a number. And we refer to macro variables using the ampersand, which is that and sign, followed by the variable's name. So examples that we could create would be something like a date macro variable, which I've just aptly named date. So you see that we have the ampersand followed by the name. Or perhaps we want to make a age macro variable, in which case I've called it age. Or maybe we're looking at certain medications, and so we're going to create a macro variable called medication. So that's the naming convention, and you can name these the same way that you would be naming variables in your SAS data sets. So there are two types of macro variables. The first category are automatic macro variables that are created by SAS and are available to you every time you use either the windowing environment or the SAS Studio environment. The second category are user-defined macro variables, and that means that you, as the programmer, are defining both the name and the value of what those variables are. So before I show you some different types of macro variables, I did want to share how we check what a macro variable's assigned value is. And to do that, we're going to use something called the put statement. And so that is where we have a percent sign immediately followed by PUT. And just as a reminder, SAS is not case sensitive, so I could have put PUTT in all caps, and you'll notice that some people prefer that style. It's going to execute the same. And so we have the percent put, and that is going to be telling SAS, I want you to put the value of this variable to my log. And so then we're going to follow that with the name of the macro variable that we're interested in. And if I execute this code, we're going to see it pop up in our log. So if I highlight that selected row of code and click the run, oops, it's because I didn't assign it yet. I'll do that in a moment. But that's how you would see it in the log. And we can see I haven't assigned a value to my macro variable because I'm getting a warning saying that date is not resolved. And that's because there's no value there. So if we want to see the name, well, I'm just going to assign it. Sorry for the lack of flow here. Okay, so if I am going to be calling the put, then it will print to the log. So I just assigned the date to be today's date. And then when I select percent put and then ask for that variable to be printed, we see that it gets printed here in the log. So you could do that for any of the macro variables that you have created or any of the automatic macro variables. If you want to see the name of the variable in the log printed before the actual value of the macro variable, you're going to use similar syntax, but instead of immediately going to the variable name, you're actually going to put this equal sign in between your ampersand and the variable name. And so when I execute that code, you'll notice that now I have my macro variable name date equal to the value that I assigned to it. And so once again, that's purely based on your preference. But if you have a lot of macro variables, maybe it's best to see what the actual name is in relation to the value. So why don't we look at some of the automatic macro variables that are available through SAS. So if I select the percent put and then use this argument underscore automatic underscore, this is going to call all of the automatic variables within SAS. And so I'll highlight that and run that code. And if we expand our log, you can see as I scroll that there are dozens of available macro variables to us. And perhaps not all of these are useful. I will say that there's really just a handful that I'm using on a frequent basis, and so I'll highlight those below. So if we only wanted to see some date related, you could find those by looking and scrolling through, but I've pulled them out already for you. And so those variables are sysday, which is the system day, system date, and then system date 9. And these are all dates, they're just formatted in this slightly different way. And you'll also notice here that I'm going to be putting to the log 3 variables in the same statement, and that's possible. So you don't have to call only one of the variables at a time. You could put them sequentially in your put statement. So I will highlight that, and we're going to print to the log. You'll see that we have system day, and today's Wednesday. System date is today's date, and then sysdate 9 is formatting the date using the date 9 format within SAS, and so that is 9 characters long, including the full 4-digit year. So some other macro variables that I use often would be those relating to the operating system and SAS version. And so those are sys scp, sys scpl, and sys var for version. So I'll highlight and put those to the log. And we can see that my operating environment is a Windows. I'm using a 64-bit 10 Pro. And then my SAS version, which is usually most important if you need this information for a method section of a paper, for example, I can see here that I have 9.4 downloaded on my machine. So it's great that we have these variables available to us, but how do we actually use them? So I will share this little print proc, and I'm going to be using a couple of these automatic variables. So you'll notice that using these automatic SAS variables, there's no need to hard code elements like the date if you're going to be executing this code over multiple days. So by using these automatic variables, they will update in relation to when you're executing your code. So I'm going to use the SAS class, or excuse me, the SAS help dataset called class. And if we open that, we can take a peek at what that looks like. But here, it's a fairly small data set. We have a couple columns, and it's about the students in a class. So I want to print this data set with a title telling us when the table was printed. So I'm going to be using in my title the sysdate 9 macro variable, and that's one of the automatic macro variables. And then I'm also going to add a footnote when I print this little report, and I want to share what SAS version was used to create the little mini report, and that would be using the sysver macro variable. And then I also want to be sharing the type of operating system and type of computer that I'm using. And so if I highlight this whole chunk of code and execute it, now in my results viewer, you're going to see that the macro variables were executed correctly. So my table was printed today, and that's in the date 9 format. We have our SAS data set table printed. We selected a subset of the variables. And then at the end, I have my report, and it's saying that this was using SAS version 9.4 on a Windows computer with this operating system. So this is really handy if you are generating reports and you want to have a complete method section saying, this is when it was executed, and here are the parameters of the system to generate that report. So you can see how automatically this has reduced my need to update this little report every time with the date and with the SAS version. Maybe I'm using this code on a different computer, so I'd have to change my operating system. This code is now executable from different machines and would give the accurate information. So one note of using these macro variables in a title or anything where you have quotations around it, we need to use double quotations to resolve that macro variable. So I'll give an example of what not to do. Here we have a title statement, and you can see that it's in single quotations, but I'm including this sysdate9 macro variable in my title, and it's not going to resolve when I submit the code. And we'll see that when it's printed to the results viewer, I have my title, but the actual value of my macro variable was not printed, but rather this text string. So if we update this and made it double quotation marks, this will now tell SAS this is a macro variable that needs to be resolved. And so now we have the date actually printed. So those were the automatic macro variables that come with SAS. But how about setting up some of our own personal macro variables? So as I did briefly before, but now we'll dive in detail, we're going to use the let statement to create the values of our macro variables. So following a similar structure as the %put, we're going to use this %let followed by the variable name. And now we're going to put an equal sign and then define what the value is that we want for that macro variable. So we're going to say maybe retroactively, I need to change the date of something. So I'm going to define my date as January 27th, 2025. So I'll submit that code. And in the log, we can see that that was submitted. I'm also going to define some other macro variables, one called author with my name, one called favnum with the value of 8, female variable with the value of F, and then this age break variable with the value of 14. So I can select all 4 of those. I will submit them. And now I have date, author, favnum, female, and age break all available to me as user-defined macros during this session. So let's just check that these values were assigned correctly. So I will highlight these 3 lines of code, and they will be printed. So I see that author was printed Lauren Gunsandel, and then favorite number equals 8. And if you'll notice, the date was printed, but the variable name was not printed. And that's because I did not include an equal sign there. So that's just exhibiting 2 different ways that you can print your macro variable values to the log. And again, if we wanted all 3 of these executed in the same line of code, we could have done that too. They don't all need to be in their own individual put statements. And finally, if you want to see all of the user-defined variables in your session, maybe you have 50 user-defined variables, you can use this underscore user underscore, similar or mirroring the syntax of that automatic that we used earlier to look at all of the SAS automatic variables. And if we submit that code, we can see those 5 user-defined macro variables. Another way to just look at what you've generated during the session. So how about actually using those macro variables? What if I want to subset my data based on some sort of grouping variable? So typically, let's say I only wanted to include the students in my class data set to be those who are female. The straightforward and hard-coded approach for that would be using a where statement, where I'm saying I want all of those who have the sex equal to female. And if we look back at that class data set, we can see that sex was just the first letter of the name, M for male and F for female. So that's where we're going to be subsetting to only the students who have a recorded sex as F. So if I execute this proc print, we now have printed to our results viewer only those students who are considered female. But let's say I wanted to print this and I have a categorical variable that has multiple categories and I want to be printing multiple times. What would be a more dynamic approach is making our subsetting criterion to be a macro variable. And then I would only need one proc print, but then I could execute it based on multiple macro variable inputs. So the way that we would do that is now I'm going to be replacing this quoted F, and inside I'm going to be putting my macro variable that I defined as female. I'll scroll back up so you can see that where I did that. So here we had %let. I have my macro variable called female, and that value is a capital F. So these two proc prints are going to be doing the exact same thing, but rather than hard coding my capital F, I now have this ability to use my macro variable where the value has been defined as a capital F. So I'm going to submit that code. And you'll notice that the table that was printed is exactly the same as the previous one because we've fed to SAS the same inputs. We are subsetting to only those who are female in this class. So I do want to also call out that we are again using that double quotation mark, but in this case, we're using double quotations because this variable sex is a character variable, and we need to use a subsetting value that is of the same type. And so we would put that in double quotations because F is a character. So what if we wanted to use a different subsetting criterion? And let's look at subsetting the ages. In this case, our ages are numeric variables. And I know that because I've used this data set a lot. But if you didn't know what the value is, you can look at that using a proc contents and see how that variable is classified. So what if I want to only look at students who are below a particular age? If you'll recall, we defined an age break to be age of 14 years old. So why don't we use that variable below and subset our class data set? So similar structure, same proc print, but instead of subsetting on sex, we're going to subset on age. And I want to say where age is less than my macro variable for age break. So we define that to be age 14. And I do want to note, if you downloaded this code before today, there is an error. I still had this labeled as fav num, which is set to 8. And so that's why your values may look different. But we're going to use age break for this today. So I'm going to submit this code, and we're going to see what happens. So now we are printing our subsetted data set. But you'll notice everybody in this data set is under the age of 14. And so our numeric macro variable did execute correctly. And because the value of age is considered a numeric variable, we do not need to put our macro variable with the value of interest in quotations. It is not a character variable. So that's how we might use individual values of a macro variable that we've defined. So let's say we printed this and we realize, oh, these actually aren't the values I want. I want to break on age of 15. All I would need to do is come back up to where I've defined that variable. I'm going to resubmit this code. We now have our age break equal to 15. And if I scroll down and execute this exact same step with no other changes, our table now reflects what that reference value was, which was 15. So I have additional entries in my table, including Alfred, who was 14, Carol, Henry, and Judy. Those 4 individuals were not in my previous print because they were at the age break. So that's how using some user-defined macro variables is really helpful. I wouldn't need to copy and paste this code if I had hard-coded an age, or I wouldn't need to change my hard-coded value here if I was going from 14 to 15, because I have this ability to simply define what my macro variable is and reassign it as needed. So how about using macro variables beyond just subsetting variables? So one thing we might want to do is do some data management, and let's say we are subsetting out only females again, but I want to create a new data set that incorporates that value into the data set name. So I'm going to pull my work library open so we can see as things are changing. So let's take our class data set here from the SAS help library, and let's subset out our data to only females. We're going to create a new data set that's called class, and I want that subsetting value of female to be tacked on to the name. So you'll notice that I have class and then that macro variable where we have the ampersand and female. Since this is a SAS data set name we are trying to define, I don't need to put that in quotations when I'm using the macro variable. But when I'm subsetting it in my where statement, again, that variable sex is considered a character variable. So I do need to put female in quotations. So let's submit this code. We look at the log. We now have 9 observations read in from our SAS help class data set. And you'll notice that I have my new data set here, class, and there's an F tacked on to the end. And that's because that was the value of our macro variable. So what if we just wanted to switch up the order of the name of our new data set, and instead we wanted it to be F class, so female class. If I submit this code, we're going to get an error because SAS is not able to recognize when the end of our macro variable name occurs and where the rest of the name starts. So SAS is looking at this and thinking, I'm trying to find a macro variable that's called female class, but you haven't defined it. And so it's not able to create a new data set with that name because it just doesn't have the ability to resolve. So the way that we can fix this is by putting a delimiting character after the end of the macro variable name before the remaining name of the data set. So here we have that macro variable name. The full name is female, and then we can put an additional period to indicate this is the end of the variable name, but I still want to have the word class at the end of this data set name. So now if we submit this code, you'll notice that we do get a correct data set here. That is F class. This is that error data set, and if I open it, it's going to be empty and give me errors because it was not able to resolve properly. So once again, if you're wanting to use your macro variable names at the beginning of a data set name, you'll need to incorporate some sort of delimiting character. I always default to a period at the end before the rest of your data set name follows. So I just want to talk a little bit about the utility of macro variables. Why would we want to use these? Why wouldn't we just hard code everything? And it's helpful to use macro variables because they prevent us from needing to cut and paste multiple code chunks or steps that is going to be changing with a single value of a variable or a data set name. So I want to show you how that might be executed in the span of a typical workflow. So we're going to be using a new data set from SAS Help called demographics. And so I'm just going to print the contents to the log so we can take a look at what is in there. So we have in this data set 197 observations, 18 variables. And then here's the list of the variables in this data set. So I am going to be defining two macro variables for this. I want to create my data name, and then I'm going to create a numeric variable for a macro variable that's called POV. And so the goal of this little section of code is I want to see the countries that have poverty greater than 25% of the population. And so I'm creating this data name variable called POV25, and then this POV variable that's defined at 0.25. So taking that demographics data set, I'm going to be creating a subset where the input variable called poverty percent is greater than or equal to my macro variable POV, and where it is not equal to period, which means missing in SAS. So basically, I'm subsetting this data set to those who have poverty at greater than or equal to 25% of the population. And then I'm going to output a new data set to my work library, and I'm going to call it my new macro variable date or dat name. And I defined that above already, POV underscore 25. So if we look at our work library, we don't have that data set yet. And once I submit this code, I now have my new data set that is called POV underscore 25, because that is the name I assigned to my macro variable dat name. So then what if we had to create a little summary statistic of this data set? Well, I can do that and include some of these conditional parameters through the macro variable inputs. And so I'm going to have a title called Statistical Summary for Proportion of Population Living on Less than $1 a Day, and then my macro variable POV or greater. So if you remember, this value is 0.25, which corresponds with 25%. And so our title should include that 0.25 in it once it resolves. And then I'm going to be using my new data set and dat name. And we're going to do some summary statistics. I also am then going to sort that data. I want to show the data descending by adult literacy proportion. And then I'm going to print another table that includes the highest literacy values among those with the poverty defined at my macro variable value. And then again, I'm going to be using my macro variable data set name. So that may be a lot, but we'll be able to see what it looks like. So I'll select everything and print it. And so now on the screen, we have those two tables that we requested to be printed, and the macro variable values have been resolved correctly. So I can see in my title statement, I do have that value of POV printed. So that's the 0.25. And then I have the numeric summary statistics that I had asked for among that subsetted population. And then I have a second table where I requested I only wanted the 5 highest literacy values among those countries with the 25% or greater poverty level. And then that is printed in this table. So what if I wanted to look at countries with greater than 50% poverty levels? Well, maybe if all of those values were hard-coded in these steps above, your immediate reaction would be, well, I can just copy and paste my original code and put in the new values at 50% instead of at 25. But we don't need to do that because we've included these dynamic macro variables where all we need to do is change the value of that input. We can execute the same code and it will be reflective of those new values. So the way that we can accomplish that is by simply reassigning what the values are to these variables. So usually I would put the macro variables before the code that reference the macro variables. So I'm going to pull those up. But just so you know, instead of copying and pasting all of the previous code, we can assign our new values and then rerun the exact same code. I'm going to do that. I have my second set of macro assignments here, and I'll just comment out these 2 lines to share that we're not needing those anymore. And I'm going to reassign my data name variable to be POV underscore 50 and using the poverty level at 0.5. So now I'm going to rerun all of that same code we just did briefly before. And now when we look at the printed titles and summaries, it has been updated to reflect our new parameters on the data. So we have a population living on less than $1 a day, where it's 50% or greater in the population. And then the highest literacy values among those countries in this new condition. And then the countries have been updated to reflect our new population. So hopefully you can see by slightly changing the way that you set up your code in using macro variables, you can immediately begin to reduce redundancy in multiple data or proc steps, or be able to introduce new parameters and not have to copy and paste multiple times throughout executing different needs in your code. So I do want to move on to macro programs now. These, I provide some examples, but once you understand macro variables, I think macro programs are an easy next step to understand. Again, we are supplying this open-ended variable type where we're defining what we want that variable value to be. We can have many variables if we want, but it's going to be housed in a single program that is within our SAS program. So you can have multiple macro programs in a single SAS file program. That was a little confusing to me when I first started working with macros. So if you have questions on that, I'm happy to answer them at the end. But how do we set up a macro program? And what we're going to do is place our desired code between 2 statements. The first is a % macro statement, and then at the end, we're going to have a % mend statement. And in our % macro and mend statements, we do assign our macro program a name. That name should be informative to some degree. And then when we want to execute that macro program with some set of inputs, we're going to use the % symbol followed by the name we assigned to the macro program in order to invoke it using the numeric or character values we are assigning to the variables. So I've created just a little macro program to exhibit what I mean, because this is all very abstract at the moment. But I have created a macro called frequencies. And what this small program is going to do is generate frequency counts and percentages. And that is going to be generated for any variable for any data set. And I'll show you how. So before I talk about the macro program, you'll notice that in using macro programs, the way that SAS color codes the various forms of syntax changes. So typically, your proc and data steps are going to be this dark blue, certain arguments are going to be light blue, and then data set names and variable names, etc., are in black. When we are using the macro program syntax, it sort of cancels that out because now we're in a little program of its own. And so, again, this is something that you just have to get used to, but your code is still going to work the same way, whether or not that color coding is there. Okay, so for our macro program, step 1 is place your desired SAS code between macro and mend statements. And so you'll see here, I have a macro statement and I have my mend statement at the end. We're going to assign our macro program name in the macro statement. And so we said this macro is going to be called frequencies. And so you can see here, we have that macro name called frequencies. And again, at our mend statement, we say we are mending the program called frequencies. So then after, we are going to define what our variables are going to be in this macro program, where we are going to be changing what those input values might be. So I have two variables. One is called source dat. So this is the source data variable. And then I have another macro variable in my program, and that is called VBL name, so variable name. Right now, these are empty because I'm simply defining my macro program. And then nested in between those two sandwich statements, I have the code that I want to execute with my values. So here we are going to use the ODS output capability to print a one-way frequency table. And you'll notice that I'm using the VBL, excuse me, using these two variables, the source data and the variable name in my macro program. And sometimes it helps for me to comment that out because my brain is so used to the color coding. But we are creating this proc frequency table for this individual variable name. And we're going to be creating this new data set using that output, and then we'll mend this. So I think it's just easier to understand what's happening by giving an example. So I'm going to highlight that whole macro program. And then I will submit this code. And when you look at the log for submitting a macro program, nothing is going to show to you using the standard default global options. It just looks like you submitted these lines of code. And so immediately, we're not seeing any issues. But now I want to be able to use this macro program. And so the way that we're going to do that is by calling the name of the macro, which is frequencies, starting with the little % sign. And you'll notice that that name does get italicized, and that can indicate to you this is now my macro program name. And I'm going to be defining those two input parameters, so our source data and the variable name of interest. And so I'm using a new SAS help data set called baseball, and I want to be summarizing the frequencies of this variable called team. And this data set includes baseball players in 1986. I don't know anything about baseball. That's okay. So now I have already run my macro program, but there have been no inputs fed to that macro program. So right now it's just sitting. It's not useful to us at all. But now if I include these input parameters and I execute the SAS macro, we are going to notice that we have created in our work library this new data set called VBL for variable, and then we have our subsetted data called team. And that's because in our macro program, that's what we defined it to do. So we were going to be doing a frequency on our input variable team, generate a one-way frequency output called VBL, and then take that data set in this data step, reassign some values, and then print it in a second new data set called variable name, which we defined to be team. And so we can see both of those, both the proc and the data steps occurred. And if we look in our results viewer, this is just the frequency procedure that automatically outputs when you're doing a proc freak if you're not choosing the no print option. But we can't use the no print option if we're using the ODS output request. So hopefully that makes a little bit of sense. but nothing. So we've defined this macro called frequencies. And just as an example, we use that baseball data set. But this macro program is flexible enough that we don't have to use it only on the baseball program. So what if we try to create some frequencies on a different data set? So we're going to use yet another SAS help data set that is called HEART, and this is the Framingham study data. And so I want to be looking at frequencies of both mortality and smoking among the individuals in this data set. And so we can do that by just submitting 2 lines of code. So the first frequencies is going to be looking at status, which is that mortality variable. And then the second line is calling that macro again, and we're just going to be looking at smoking. So I can submit both of these at the same time. And now what's happened is we have executed our macro called frequencies using these inputs. And then immediately we again executed our frequencies macro using the second 2 sets of inputs. And with very little redundancy in code, we now have our output data sets, smoking and status, available to us. So if we look at it, this is the status variable, which was looking at death. And so our one-way frequencies have been output for those who were alive and dead. And now those are in a single data set that we could use for creating a report or something else. So we're creating new data sets and generating statistics using the exact same code in that macro program, but we're supplying varying source data and varying variables to that macro program, which results in unique outputs. And this would be considered dynamic coding, where we have not hard coded anything into the macro program, but we're supplying these varying inputs to it. So I do want to provide a few tips for how to go about starting to use both macro variables and macro programs. And my first tip would be to write your code as you would without the macro facility at first. So usually what I do is I write out my data and proc steps as I would where it has individual uses where I'm supplying a hard-coded input, a hard-coded data name, whatever your needs are in those data and procs. And then I confirm that that code is actually working correctly. I view the log, I look at the output, I look at the results if there's any types of statistics being generated, and I ensure that that code is actually structured correctly. Once I know that that code is set up correctly, that's when I can begin to swap out the elements in those procs and data steps to be the macro equivalents. So those could be using just a macro variable or 2, so it doesn't need to be in a macro program. Or perhaps you do want it to be in a macro program and you start to look at what are the inputs I can supply to that macro program where it would be those varying input values. And so then you would update in your code to be reflective of how you call those. So the ampersand followed by the name of interest. So after you have swapped all of those inputs and outputs to be reflective of what would be changing every time you submit new inputs, then I typically supply one set of the inputs to that macro program. And I would include this global option called options logic. And that will print if you're having any errors or any types of important information to the log as you've supplied those inputs. So I can show you how you would do that. You would put it up here. And so by supplying options and logic, it's now going to change how we see things output to the log. And this can be really helpful for diagnosing and troubleshooting errors. So if there are any errors in that executed code from the one set of inputs, then you can troubleshoot as you need. Otherwise, if there are no errors, then I confirm that the output is what I would be expecting. The results are what I would be expecting for those inputs. And then from there, you can add complexity. You can add more modules to the macro, so including more data steps, more proc steps, whatever you might need, and then play around with the structure. And then finally, if you are going to be supplying multiple sets of input values, that's where you can begin to call that macro numerous times with whatever inputs you are needing for your code. So I do have some extras below for those of you who are interested in reading a little bit more. I didn't have time today to get into some other capabilities of the macro facility, but one of those that is really helpful is this call symput X statement that you can use in data steps. And I encourage you to read that extra code at the end because I do want to take time for questions if there are questions at this time.
I'm actually gonna put the attendance survey in the chat for now. You can still ask questions, but I just want to.
Thank you, Samantha. If there are no immediate questions, I will just show then what it looks like to use that global and logic option. So when we look at our log, I'm going to pull it to this side so we can see both at the same time. So I'm going to submit my macro program. Again, this is just setting up the definition of the frequencies program. Nothing of interest is printed here. SAS is just acknowledging this code has been run. But now let's give and supply some actual inputs to that macro program. And we see a little bit more descriptive information at this point about what occurred with the macro. So it's telling us we began execution. The parameter called source.dat does have a value, and that value is the SAS help.baseball data set. And then we do have a parameter for our variable name, and that is called team. So this is helpful. And then, you have your typical output from submitting SAS code. And then it tells you that your macro did end its execution. If you have an error in your macro, this is very helpful because you may see here parameter source.dat was not resolved. And that may be because you did not supply the input value for your source.dat variable. Or if there's some sort of computation error, you'll be able to see that printed to the log. So I don't like having the mlogic on all the time because it just takes up valuable log real estate. But when you are setting up a new macro program or you're newer to writing macros, this can be really helpful to try to troubleshoot where you may be having some errors. Any questions? Well, if there are no questions, please feel free to come to our office hours if you do find that things aren't working correctly, if you work through this code. And if you don't attend office hours, Samantha and I are always available by email if you're interested. She's actually the instructor for the Colorado School of Public Health's full semester SAS course if you are interested in becoming an expert SAS programmer. And this will have been, or this is recorded, and so you'll find the recording for all of our CU Data Week sessions uploaded to our center's website and YouTube channel probably in about a week or two. So if you want to come back and refer to what you've learned during the week, those will be available shortly.
Thank you so much, Lauren. That was an amazing presentation. Even though I do teach the SAS course, I still learned a lot. So thank you
So
so much.
thank you. Thank you, everybody, for attending.